Hello students, today we have to start with the term market equilibrium. In previous class, we already know what are the market forces, that is the demand and supply. What are the major features of your demand and supply also we come across, like the meaning of the demand, demand schedule, then demand curve, market demand schedule, market demand curve. What are the factors responsible for the shift in the demand curve? In the same way, the second force of the market is known as the supply. Meaning of the supply, then definition of the supply, law of supply, then supply schedule, and thereafter also we know what is the change in supply and change in quantity supply and what are the factors responsible for the shift in supply curve. Then after knowing that, we have to enter the next phase of the second module, that is called as the market equilibrium. Market equilibrium is to be takes place where quantity demand exactly equals to the quantity supply. Quantity demand must be equal to the quantity supply. We already know the concept of the quantity demand and quantity supply. The law of demand tells us when price increases, demand fall, and when price fall, demand increases. So, there is existence of a inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And in case of your supply, the law of supply tells us other things being constant, when price increases, supply also increases, and when price falls, supply also falls. So, there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supply. Then the demand curve is a downward sloping curve, supply curve is an upward sloping curve, and where both the terms are to be intersect each other, that is the equilibrium point. In order to illustrate it, we have to take into account a particular example. About example number, let us say the price and quantity demand, this is the quantity supply. Let us say we take the price like 1, 2, 3, I mean you can start with the 0 also, no problem about it. You can start with the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and these are the rupees, price in terms of your rupees, right. When there is a 0 rupees there, 16 is to be demanded, right, and supply is to be, let us say 1 is there, or we take into account there is a 4 because we take the reverse part of it. Then when demand, when price increases, what about the demand? Demand definitely reduces, and we have to putting the values of it, the 12, thereafter 10, thereafter 8, then 6, thereafter 4. That means the number of units to be demanded. You can take into account the, let us say ice cream. The value of the ice cream, there is a summer season, you can take into account the price is to be 0 when, I mean the freely the ice cream can it be given to you, the cone are there, ice cream cone, you can demand it 16 unit of ice cream cone at the same time. But when the price to be increases, when it turns to the 1 you demanded 14, when it is increases to the rupees 2 you purchases 12 and so on, when it reaches to the rupees 6 per unit you purchase the 4 number of units. But at the 0 price, the amount of the quantity supply, the supply of the number of can it be supply is to be the 4, and it to be next is to be 6, thereafter if we take into account it is 8, then it is be 10, then 12, then 14, then 16. Okay. So, these are the number of units of the ice cream we are able to demand and supply at a particular price. Now, where is the equilibrium? Actually, the equilibrium is to be takes place when quantity demand equal to the quantity supply. When both the terms are equals to each other, that is the point is called as the equilibrium quantity. And what about the price? Now, 3 is called as the equilibrium price. Now, let us say put it on the graph. While you put in the graph on the horizontal axis, I may count the quantity. Vertical axis I mean price. आमे जतले डिमांड को पकेबा corresponding to the different price आमे जतले पकेबा ताले आमे डिमांड कर्व रे कोन हबो ना डाउनवर्ड स्लोपिंग हबो. This is the demand curve. Similarly, जतले आमे supply को put करिबा according to the price we face the supply is to the upward sloping curve. This is the supply curve and this is the demand curve. And this is the point of the equilibrium. This is the point of the equilibrium. And when we drop a perpendicular, we find this is the equilibrium quantity QE, or it is called the optimum quantity. And here in our example it is 10. Similarly, when you drop a perpendicular to the price axis, we find equilibrium price is PE, which is in our example is rupees 3, right. This is the equilibrium situation where quantity demanded and quantity supply, they are equals to each other. Now, suppose there is a rise in price. Let us say if you take into account this is the situation of the price. Price is to be increases to from rupees 3 to rupees 4. Then what happen? When price increases from rupees 3 to rupees 4, we find the amount of the demand is reduces, obviously price increases when demand falls. The amount of the demand is to be 8 units of the ice cream. When price falls, quantity supply definitely falls. That means there is, when price increases, supply also be increases because there is a direct relationship. When price increases from 3 to 4, supply increases from 10 to 12. That means if you take into account that corresponding to this particular demand and supply, this is the situations where there is a surplus part, surplus productions. These are the surplus situations, that means when supply is to be greater than the demand, quantity supply is greater than the quantity demanded. If you take the reverse concept, reverse in the part, let us say when the price is falls from 3 rupees to, let us say assuming it the 2 rupees. When price falls, what about the demand? Definitely price falls means other thing being constant, demand increases. Demand increases from 10 to 12, and when price falls, supply also falls from 10 to 8. So, at this situation we find the unit number of supply is to be 8 and that of demand is to be 12. Then what we find? This is the concept of your shortages. So, there is a surplus situation, there is a shortages situation. When shortages to be arises, now when the quantity supply is to be less than the quantity supply, I mean demand. When supply is to be less than the demand, that is called the, I mean deficit part, or that is called the shortages, and the reverse is the case when the supply is more than demand, it is called as the surplus situations. Then if there is a shortages and surplus situation, then how to reach the point of the equilibrium? In which way we have to finding out the point of the equilibrium? At this situation, if it is a surplus part, our intention to be lower down the price. So, we have to pressure the price, I mean we have to down the price. Where, how we have to down it, I mean reducing the price, that we have to think about. In order to reducing the price, then we have to lower down the, either we have to shift the demand, or we have to reducing the supply from this point to this point, or increase the demand from this point to this point. So, you have to either you have to increasing it or you have to reducing it, right. So, that means here the demand curve is to be constant, supply is to be there. Now, our intention at the rupees 4, there is a surplus part, there is a disequilibrium, equality between the demand and supply is not there. In order to bring the equality, आमे जतले equal आनिया को चाहिबा तार आमे कोन करिया पड़िबो ना प्राइस को कमेबा, ना प्राइस को कमेया पे हेले आमे कोन करिबा ना प्राइस को जतले आमे कमेबा फ्रॉम 4 rupees रो 3 rupees को आनिबा आमे कोन करिया पड़िबो ना डिमांड को बढ़ाया को पड़िबो एंड सप्लाई को कमेया को पड़िबो, राइट. So, here I have to be taken into account that the movement along the demand एटी कौन कले आमे ए पॉइंट रो एटी की जीवा movement along the supply करिबा किबा movement along the demand करिबा. So, either the case may be we are reaching the point of the equilibrium. Similarly, when there is a shortages part, যেতବେଳେ shortages ଅଛି ସେ shortages situation रो ଆମେ କେମିତି equilibrium point ରେ ପହଞ୍ଚିବା ନା in order to reaching the point of the equilibrium we have to increase the price level हमको price level को बढ़ाइବାକୁ पड़िबो चला price को जतला हमें बढ़ाइबा let from the 2 rupees to the 3 rupees when price is increases then number of ice cream to be demanded it will reduces from 12 to 10 and it will supply increases from 8 to 10. So, here we find the reaching the point of the equilibrium either we have to move along the supply curve or we have to move along the demand curve. That means any manner we have to change the concept, that means the changing the supply and the changing the demand we are able to reaching the point of the equilibrium. Now, if this is the situations are there upward pressure and the downward pressure, how we have to move to the upward pressure of the supply and the changing the demand and supply and you have to be reaching the point of the equilibrium the downward pressure also be there. Both the pressure upward pressure and the downward pressure both the pressure have to be required in order to reaching the point of the equilibrium. Because suppose the question to be arises which one is the most important factor whether the demand or the supply that plays an important role in order to determine the equilibrium price or equilibrium quantity. Actually as Marshall tells us in order to cut a piece of paper gote kagaj ko katiya pai hele we require the both side of the blade of a scissor gote coinch ro dita dhara ma dakkar the upper blade as well as the lower blade. So, the both the blades are required in order to cut a piece of paper. Sethipai in order to reaching the point of the equilibrium we have to take into account both demand and supply to finding out the point of equilibrium. Now, after that knowing the terms what is equilibrium and what are the forces to get obtaining the point of the equilibrium, now we have to move to the next what are the 3 steps to analyzing the changes in the equilibrium. What are the 3 steps to change the point of the equilibrium? कौन कौन हमें 3टा step अच्छी in order to finding out the point of the equilibrium. ଆମେ ଏଠି କ'ଣ ଦେଖିଲେ ନା ଗୋଟେ ହେଲା ଆମେ ଚେଞ୍ଜିଂ କରିବା ସପ୍ଲାଏ କିମ୍ବା ଚେଞ୍ଜିଂ କରିବା ଡିମାଣ୍ଡକୁ ଦ୍ୟାଟ୍ ମିନ୍ସ ଦ ଡିମାଣ୍ଡକୁ ଚେଞ୍ଜ କରିବା କିମ୍ବା ସପ୍ଲାଏକୁ ଚେଞ୍ଜ କରିବା ଚେଞ୍ଜ ଇନ୍ ଦ ସେନ୍ସ ଦ୍ୟାଟ୍ ମିନ୍ସ ଦ ଟର୍ମସ୍ ଦ୍ୟାଟ୍ ଇଜ ଦ expansion and contraction of the demand and expansion and contraction of the supply. So, the first of all what are the 3 points we have to write down the terms. Now, one is to be decide whether the event shift the demand curve or shift the supply curve. हमको जज करिया पड़िबो हमको डिमांड कर्व को शिफ्ट करिया पड़िबो ना सप्लाई कर्व को शिफ्ट करिया पड़िबो ना बोथ को शिफ्ट करिया पड़िबो. लेट्स हैव टू राइट डाउन दोस थिंग्स. द 3 स्टेप्स टू analyzing the point of equilibrium. कौन 3 स्टेप अच्छे ना प्रथम है ना चेंज इन डिमांड एंड सप्लाई. द फर्स्ट स्टेप इज टू बी decide whether okay the event shift the demand curve or supply curve or both. You have to decide whether the event to be shifted, which one to be shifted, demand curve to be shifted, supply curve shifted or both to be shifted. That is the first step. Next, decide whether the curve shift right or left. Decide whether the curve means both the demand curve and supply curve shift to right or left. So, you have to decide whether the demand or supply curve whether to be shift to left or right. Then use the demand and supply diagram by using the demand and supply diagram, right. You have to take into account what are the steps to be that. The first step is to be compare the initial equilibrium to the new equilibrium, compare the initial equilibrium to new equilibrium, and second one is to be decide whether there is change in decide whether there is change in demand, there is a change in quantity or price. That means आमे कौन देखिबा ये जो तीन टा स्टेप अछि आमे कौन एनालाइजिंग करिबा इक्विलिब्रियम पॉइंट रे पहुंचा पे ना द फर्स्ट हला आमे इवेंट को देखिया पड़े को इवेंट वेदर द डिमांड सप्लाई और बोथ which things to be taken account into reaching the point of the equilibrium. आमे इक्विलिब्रियम रे पॉइंट रे पहुंचा पे हेले कोटा को शिफ्ट करिया पड़िबो. सेकेंड है कौन ना डिसाइड द कर्व जो आम चेंज करुचे राइट को चेंज करिबा ना लेफ्ट को चेंज करिबा दैट वी हैव टू डिसाइड. नेक्स्ट आम से जो इक्विलिब्रियम डायग्राम को नहीं आम देखा कौन आम कंपेयर करवा इनिशियल पॉइंट ऑफ इक्विलिब्रियम कौन अच्छे इनिशियल प्राइस एंड क्वांटिटी केते अच्छे देन सब्सिक्वेंटली आमर डिमांड ऑफ सप्लाई दैट मीन्स सब्सिक्वेंटली यू हैव टू टेक इन अकाउंट व्हाट इज द इक्विलिब्रियम क्वांटिटी और इक्विलिब्रियम price, that the impact upon the equilibrium price and quantity we have to take into account. So, these are the three steps of judging the terms how we have to reaching the point of the equilibrium. Now, we have to take into account the different steps how applying these three situations, analyzing these three situations, I mean 3 steps of situation to reaching the point of the equilibrium. We have to explain one by one. First step we have to take into account change in equilibrium, change in equilibrium by shifting the demand curve. Shifting the demand curve. हमें डिमांड कर्व को शिफ्ट करिकरी हमें केंदी इक्विलिब्रियम पॉइंट रे पहुंचबा ताको हमें देखिबा. एंड इन ऑर्डर टू शिफ्ट द डिमांड कर्व we take certain example. Let's say for example suppose the demand nowadays what you find there is a the weather is to be I mean where the finding out the thrusty mode to be that means we require more number of ice cream as in the hot climate to be that in our society. Now the demand for the ice cream to be increases, then if the demand of the ice cream to be increases then how you have to depicting on the curve. Let us say we have to take the first situation changes in the equilibrium the shift in the demand curve. Now shift demand curve shift right को shift करिबो कि left को shift करिबो right को केतले shift करिबो. Now we know the quantity demand it is a functions of its price, income, taste, preferences and so on, price of related commodities. आमे कौन कहूचे ना price to be constant रखी दबा आमे अन्य जिनिस को changes करिबा आमे जब अन्य जिनिस को changes करिबा then how you have to finding the point of the shift the equilibrium. If the income increases the income price करी गला the taste price करी गला the preference increase करूची ताले आमे कौन देखुचे ना डिमांड टा शिफ्ट करिवो टुवर्ड्स राइट जेतरा प्रेफरेंस फॉल करिवो इनकम फॉल करिवो हमर डिमांड टा डाउन को शिफ्ट करिवो. सेति पे हम देखिया पड़िवो जे शिफ्ट कहली मो द शिफ्ट इन द डिमांड कर्व ना को सिचुएशन रे हम डिमांड को शिफ्ट करिवो ना शिफ्ट करिया गोटे ओकेजनल देखिबा सिचुएशन देखिबा कोन ना जेतरा हम इनकम बढ़ी जाउथबो हमर टेस्ट प्रेफरेंसेस बढ़ी जाउथबो प्राइस ऑफ अदर रिलेटेड कमोडिटी देखिया पड़िवो पोस्टपोननेस ऑफ द आई मीन देखिया आई मीन एक्सपेक्टेशन फ्यूचर एक्सपेक्टेशन को देखिया पड़िवो राइट. लेट्स से स्टार्ट विथ वन ग्राफ हमें गोटे ग्राफ ने लेठी हॉरिजॉन्टल एक्सिस रे हम नउचे डिमांड of your that means the quantity that's called the ice cream is called the quantity. We take the terms ice cream, here is the price, here is the price of ice cream, right, and this is the demand curve downward sloping, this is the supply curve is to be that. And what do you find? Initial point of equilibrium is here, E is the equilibrium point, initial point of equilibrium. Corresponding to that, what is the equilibrium quantity? Now equilibrium quantity is to be O1 and equilibrium price is to be P1. Now what the situation? Suppose there is a hot climate, the demand for the ice cream to be increases, that the preference of the demand curve, I mean the demand is to be shifted towards right because the preference of the people to be increases. लोक मानकर प्रेफरेंस इंक्रीज करिगला सेतिपय से कोन गला अधिक डिमांड कला आइसक्रीम को. When the demand curve shift towards right if the preference increases, demand curve shift towards right from the D to D1. When the demand shifted, it intersect the given supply curve. Co-point equilibrium होचंती. Let's say it is initial थिला E1, right now it is the E2. बर्तमान कौन है इनिशियल पॉइंट ऑफ इक्विलिब्रियम थिला E1 जितेले डिमांड टा शिफ्ट करि जाउची आमे देखुचे गिवन सप्लाई कर्व डिमांड जते शिफ्ट करूची दैट इंटरसेक्ट द गिवन सप्लाई कर्व एट द पॉइंट सेपरेट पॉइंट E2 and due to that we find the new point of quantity that is called the Q2 and new point of a price that is called the P2. That means both price and quantity are increases. जितेबेले supply constant अच्छी supply is to be remains constant, then supply curve to be remains sticky. When there is a demand for the ice cream demand it will increase because of the preferences of the people, thereby the equilibrium shifted from E1 to E2, which leads to both quantity and price to be changes. The demand for price and demand for, that is the demand and supply, that is called the quantity, it is increases and simultaneously price also be increases. So, आमे कौन देखले situation first of all जो 3 step रे decide आमे कौन करिबा demand को shift करिबा ना supply को shift करिबा ना आमे demand को shift करिबा. Second consider decide whether the curve to be shift towards right or fall because the आमे कौन करे demand shift करछे because ice cream demand rise कला आमे right को shift करिबा. Then after that third step कौन ना judge it whether there is the changes in the equilibrium quantity and price. Initial price is how much, initial quantity is how much, then after the changes then what happened to the price and quantity. These are the 3 steps. First decide आमे डिमांड को कोआर्ड को शिफ्ट करिबा राइट को शिफ्ट करिबा लेफ्ट को कोनटा शिफ्ट करिया फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल आमे कहा को शिफ्ट करिया डिमांड और सप्लाई देन आमे जानिले कि डिमांड को शिफ्ट करिया सेकंड स्टेप कोन आमे राइट को शिफ्ट करिया ना लेफ्ट को शिफ्ट करिया ना आमे राइट को शिफ्ट करिया ना थर्ड वर्तमान इक्विलिब्रियम रे केमिति इंपैक्ट आछे दीज आर द 3 steps we have to analyzing in every situations. Okay, that's all for today. In the coming class we have to start with the next steps, how the changes in the supply, shift in the supply that affect the equilibrium price and quantity. Thank you for today.